It's easy to forget that modern Russia only came into existence 30 years ago from the ashes of the Soviet Union. It had to start from scratch in creating a rules-based market economy. There was none of the legal infrastructure that underpins private property in the West. There were no laws to support commercial enterprises or the ownership of the means of production. Yet the Soviet Union had a very well-developed criminal class and shadow economy at the time of its collapse. Apart from criminals, there were few people with capital resources to take advantage of the changes when the old system collapsed. Is it any wonder that Russia developed into the world's largest kleptocracy? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Today, I'm speaking with Mark Voyger, Director of the Master's Program at the American University in Kyiv, Ukraine, and Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Mark is an experienced special advisor on Russia, Eurasia, and the Middle East, with a distinguished history of working for the military. He is skilled in international affairs, government, and intelligence. Mark is a senior Army civilian professional with a double master's in international relations and public administration. He is fluent in Russian, Arabic, French, Spanish, Italian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, and Turkish. And significantly, for our conversation today, he is a specialist in the area of Russia's lawfare, that is, legal warfare, and how the evolution of law contributes to the creation of a rules-based society. Mark, welcome.
Jonathan, good evening, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to start off this video slightly differently from the ones I've created so far. I'd like to start with a quote from history, as I think the insights from travelers can often shed light on modern Russia, which to an extent is a society anchored in the deep past. So the Marquis de Custine traveled to Russia after the French Revolution, which he experienced, and was able to look at Russian politics and society through that lens of having seen the French Revolution play out. He says, "I do not believe I am exaggerating in affirming that the Empire of Russia is a country whose inhabitants are the most miserable on earth, because they suffer at one and the same time the evils of barbarism and of civilization." Now, Mark, you've observed Russia up close. You've seen its politics play out. You know its history and literature and language, and you've lived in a society, Ukraine, that is trying to extricate itself from that Soviet system, which was itself a giant experiment in human behavior. How do we unpack this quote from Custine?
Marquis Custine, of course, was absolutely right when he dissected really the nature of Russian society in the 19th century by using the comparison of barbarism and modern civilization. And I'm sure he would have used the same analogy, if you will, nowadays, if he had been a witness of this war, its barbarity, but also the destruction brought upon the Ukrainian nation by the modern weaponry in the possession of the Putin regime. I mean, he would have used the same words to describe this unique and corrosive, explosive mixture that really exemplifies what Russia is all about. It's the mixture of this, indeed, backwardness of social development, and as from what we see, we've been seeing it for almost half a year now. Really, despicable acts that are committed by using, the advanced technology of the 20th and 21st century. So, unfortunately, this is a clear indication that things in Russia never change, or at least they try to change for certain periods of time. The so-called processes of liberalization, that follow certain revolutions or certain changes in the power structure. but unfortunately, the underlying processes remain the same, and sadly, nothing has changed from almost 200 years ago. And we're seeing again and again this, this mixture of murderous barbarism, as he put it, and of course, this, in this day and age, controlled by a regime which is in a possession of the most advanced, not only military system, but systems of espionage, cyber capabilities, and of course, mastery of twisting the law, which is exactly what we are talking about.
And can we take that back to the Soviet Union as well? Because I think, a lot of what the Soviet Union produced was, not always as negative as the war we're seeing at the moment. If you look at the space race and the extraordinary achievements there, I remember seeing this incredible clip of an old lady in Siberia living in a wooden hut, watching, Gagarin going to space on a television set. And in Russia, you have this extraordinary contrast, don't you? Which really, underlines what Kustin is saying. You have extraordinary human achievement in its history, but you don't have the basis in a mature political or legal framework that underpins some of these achievements.
Yes, this is, of course, the I would say absurd nature of this discrepancy that you've identified. There's definitely this incoherence really between the two Russias. The one on top, where we have all these scientific achievements, where we have this obviously everything that you mentioned from the Soviet period, and then of course, the Soviet period, the Soviet Union, at least on the surface, tried to inspire some sort of a faith in the future. I mean, it's all about the upcoming communism, this idealistic society. So yes, there was a lot of bloodshed, going on within, society and in Soviet history, but at least in the ideological sense, there was this idealization of the Soviet future. In this case, the Russian regime relies upon, a mythical vision of a past that never was really. It's the mythologized past, that we call it. That really brings back effectively the worst practices of the 18th and the 19th century in a political sense, in a legal sense, social mores, if you will. I mean, it doesn't project any image for the future. It's all about what Russia was, the greatness, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, during Soviet times. It's all evoking those images of dead politicians, of doctrines that have not been seen in the West for decades and for centuries. But now we're actually facing a Russia that has resurrected the worst political realities and practices of centuries past, and therefore, this discrepancy between definitely the social development and as we said, the scientific, technical, and other achievements is astonishing.
And until recently, Putin's regime wasn't necessarily an ideological regime. You couldn't point to a set of ideas that were underpinning it. It seemed to be fairly pragmatic, and the only underlying aim was really sort of power, typically for a small number of people. But it does seem to have gained a kind of ideological flavor, hasn't it, in the last couple of years, really since the invasion of Crimea, potentially. But as you say, I mean, is this all backward looking? Is there anything forward looking that you can see within the ideology of the regime?
Yes, the future that Russia is projecting upon its own peoples, and of course upon its neighbors and the world, is that of the imperialist past of the world, and it's nothing to behold and admire, nothing to dream of. It's all about spite and vengeance. It's revanchism, revisionism, irredentism, that is reclaiming territories, rectifying, for past offenses, let's put it that way, or perceived offenses, as Putin constantly keeps reminding us that the West is guilty of this or that, or its neighbors don't have a right to exist, etc., etc. And so it's really it's ideological. I'm just not sure if it just became ideological, or it was a well-concealed tendency or trend within the members of the elite. I mean, they were KGB who had sworn to promote the cause of communism. Maybe they didn't believe it in their heart, but ultimately, I mean, they were active members of this regime for several decades before it collapsed. And so it seems to me that it was just a mimicry for about 2 decades, when they pretended that they are trying to modernize Russia, that they have moderated, and then suddenly they've just gone back to their roots. And this is what we see, the fangs of the old KGB and the old Soviet system, just this time wrapped in this fictitious, neo-imperial mythology, really. Of course, mixed with orthodoxy, state-sponsored orthodoxy, and all sorts of other quite dangerous ideas that actually have poisoned the minds of an entire nation, as we have seen over the last several months, but also several years.
And of course, some people who aren't that close to Russian history will see the Orthodox angle as being new, but actually Stalin was very adept, wasn't he, at manipulating orthodoxy and Orthodox history. You think of Eisenstein's film of Alexander Nevsky and so on. I mean, the Soviet regime did utilize orthodoxy to try and reinforce its power as well, didn't it?
They absolutely did, and let's not remember, Stalin was his first education was a student at the seminary, which is basically this religious high school, and therefore the example that you give, of course, Eisenstein's film during the Second World War was meant to bring back a sort of inspiration within the Soviet people who had lost it, because who had lost really they had suffered through the Great Famine, of course, the Ukrainians, and then the Great Purges, and now war was upon them, and Stalin came up with this ruse, with this stratagem. Okay, well, let's reach back into this the depths of the Russian psyche, rather, and use this religiously motivated, religiously expressed idea to mobilize and organize the people, and so they can actually resist the German the Nazi invasion better. So Stalin was a pragmatic, that's for sure. So that's only logical that he would try to use the church, and of course later generations of Soviet leaders also used the church. It was used for intelligence operations, if you will, overseas. It was used to gather information within the Soviet Union. I mean, they realized that it's as long as the real believers are out of the church, let's put it out of the hierarchy, and you control that hierarchy, because effectively it's owned by the KGB. It's penetrated by agents, from top to bottom, from the patriarch down to the lowest clergy. Therefore, it could be quite useful. Which and nowadays this policy has paid off. We have this bizarre version of the Caesaropapism principle, the Caesar and the Lord's temporal and Lord spiritual of the Middle Ages. That is the state and the church in Russia, supporting one goal, which is the rebirth of Russian imperialism across Eurasia.
We're going to talk quite about law, aren't we, during these sessions? And having lived in Russia and kind of observed it in the 90s, where some of the foundations of its modern sort of property laws were put in place, and seeing the difficulty of that, I came to the firm belief that law isn't just about what's written on pieces of paper. Law is also about a culture of observance. You might almost say even a sort of moral impulse to follow law rather than continuously trying to break it or circumvent it. Do you see any big difference then in the Soviet Union compared to modern Russia? Because you do have this set of people who have transitioned from the old system to the new, but there was a period of relative liberal economic policy. I mean, what's the biggest difference in the culture of law between the Soviet Union and modern Russia?
It's quite similar, I think, to the difference that we see in their ideology. On the one hand, as we said, the Soviet Union tried at least to inspire some faith in the future, in progressivism. It's another question how, of course, to what extent it was able to bring it about and implement it, but at least in a theoretical, notional sense. In a similar way, the Soviet law was designed to bring about, basically, or support the coming of this communist ideal society, right? At the same time, the Soviet law was designed also to keep the Soviet elite in power, that is, to justify the supremacy of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and of course all the repression and all the violence, in the state-applied violence, rather, was had to be justified by the various aspects of the Soviet laws. But its authority derived from the leadership of the Communist Party and, of course, the communist ideology. As you correctly pointed out, this regime hasn't been, or wasn't, so ideological until a few years ago, and therefore the Russian law was primarily, again, pragmatic in a sense that it was designed also to keep in place or to keep tabs on the population, which is similar with the Soviet law, but it's designed mostly to serve, again, the perpetuation of Putin and his regime. So on the one hand, back in the day, you had this grandiose ideology and a much more pervasive Communist Party with its entire apparatus. Now we have Putin's regime and Putin's circle, which is relatively more limited, of course, number of people. And then currently Russian law, of course, doesn't derive its legitimacy from this communist ideology. I would say it's more pragmatic in the way it exploits both the domestic nuances and the domestic realities in Russia, and also how it fits within the international law. Because back in the day, the Soviet law would also contravene and contradict quite often, what is viewed as Western law. At least for the first 15 years of Putin's rule, you would have Russia pretending, or at least the Russian diplomatic and legal community, acting as if they accept the established international and legal order. And from what we see now, they've been trying to actually subvert it from within. So on the one hand, you see the rejection of the Soviet system for a certain period of time, and now you have this subversion from within, and effectively they've reached the stage of trying to take down many of the main precepts of international legal order and its foundations. So the differences are not so great, but in qualitative terms. But definitely they do exist, and the law is an important tool of the current regime in Russia.
So if we talk about the Soviet system and what was inherited from it, one of the key things, of course, was this love of bureaucratic language, procedural language. And I think we can see in the behavior of Putin, Lavrov, and of course, diplomats around the world that are justifying their aggression, you can see the use of this language still in place, but now it's a kind of propagandist smokescreen to cover up the unlawful behavior. So what do you make of this sort of love of this sort of language?
Well, this love, of course, this love affair with what we can call the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, and that is the outward, appearance of being legal, as opposed to the essence of being legitimate. Okay, so this love affair goes back a long time. So again, just like in the case of all the surviving tenets of the Soviet system that you pointed out, from the church to ideology, etc. This has its deeper roots in the Soviet Union. So I wouldn't look primarily for the differences with the Soviet system, although they exist, and I'll try to throw some light on it. But I'll rather look for, again, its continuation, and really we should think of the 20 years of or 15 or 14 years of Putin, let's say Putin between 1999 and 2014, as a brief hiatus, after which he resorted to the old ways that he knew, and especially after February 2022, this has become perfectly clear. So this bureaucratic language, of course, is meant to create the outward appearance of legality. Putin is a master of making everything look legal, and not only himself, of course, but Lavrov, Medvedev. I mean, they're quite good because they're all of them have either legal training or are experienced diplomats and know how to play the system. And of course, Russia has, through all its hypostases, whether it's the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire or the post-Yeltsin regime, they've used the law extensively. So the bureaucratic language is meant to create an appearance within Russia that everything is according to the law. That when you arrest Navalny, it's not because of his political views, but it's because he didn't file some tax return, or he didn't return in time for some court session. So there is always some legal requirement that was not followed, and therefore he's guilty. That's the law, right? And then internationally, of course, they exploit all sorts of loopholes. So again, it's this explosive mixture of quite dangerous, of course, of this legalistic language and propaganda. So that creates this appearance that everything they do is in line with the law, and even more dangerously, that they really swear by international law. Think about it. If they would just say, we don't care about international law, might gives us rights, and therefore, we do whatever we want. No, they, at every step of the way, they swear by their adherence to what they say is permitted to them by this precept or another of international law, and therefore it becomes really difficult to counter and beat them, because they use our own weapons, our own system. They try to defeat us on our own term, and therefore this language is not only empty words, it's a carefully designed tool to actually manipulate this very international system that gives credence and legality to this entire international order.
And they're in some ways economical with their terror as well, aren't they? I mean, at the moment, they're not, because they weren't getting what they wanted using those legal frameworks, using international institutions. But to an extent, if they can get away with achieving their objectives by using some kind of legal framework, they'll do that. But it's clear that comes a point where other societies will stop at that point when it becomes illegal, or there's no justification for going there. I mean, it doesn't always work, and some people might point to the Iraq War and so on as being overstepping legal boundaries. But clearly, Russia has an objective, and no matter what, they're going to go after it. And at the moment, of course, I think it's become plain, hasn't it? They've stepped outside of the sort of hybrid warfare, hybrid legal language, and it's almost as plain as day to most people, except perhaps, one or two, like Mearsheimer and Chomsky and a few others, what's actually going on. And it's a pure kind of power play, isn't it?
Absolutely, because really their exploitation of the international legal system, of the international system as a whole, is a function of the correlation of forces, as they used to say during Soviet times, at each particular juncture. Obviously, if you are weaker, if you are Putin, in 2008, you wouldn't be able to afford as much as you do in 2014 when you take over Crimea, and definitely when in 2022 you believe you have it all because you believe you got the Europeans, to comply with all sorts of various energy deals and the corruption schemes, etc. Therefore, again, if you can get away with just using not only this bureaucratic language, but exploiting the loopholes in the international legal regimes, then of course it's much better than going to war. If you can't, what you do is create legal facts on the ground, and therefore, in 2008, there comes Medvedev and the Medvedev doctrine, and then you start passportizing, the people in South Ossetia. Suddenly, you have, surprise, surprise, Russian citizens, which the Medvedev doctrine, states clearly that need to be protected by the Russian army. So, you've created facts on the ground that it all looks very legal from the Russian point of view, and the next thing is, of course, you manipulate, the system, and then you claim that you're there, you're not an aggressor, you're just there to protect your citizens. The same thing happened, of course, in Ukraine, and in Crimea they invented a fictitious Russian Crimean nation, which is even a legal and factual absurdity. But again, they never said to this day, they reject the notion that they've occupied or, Crimea illegally. They say, no, we were just there to support the legal right of the people to a self-expression, and in this case, ethnic self-determination trumps the principle of sovereignty of nations. So of course, it's cherry picking. They pick one principle that suits them at a particular point in time, and then, but then when it comes to Kosovo and Yugoslavia, of course, then they hold on to the sovereignty of the central government, the central authority. And so again, it's very selective. It's very, it's manipulative. That's clear, but it's quite they're quite adept at really playing those different legal principles. And again, as I said, exploiting this very international system and trying to beat us with our own tools.
That's going to get much clearer to many more people, and I think that leads us on to quite a tricky topic, because there is one propagandist line, and it's based on a fairly nihilistic false equivalence, but it does seem to get a lot of traction in the West, and that's their whataboutism, that the West is also imperialistic, that most European nations have troubled imperial pasts, and that somehow Russia is a kind of anti-empire. And absurd as it is, some people actually sort of buy this line, don't they?
They do, and please allow me to just quickly go back in the history of the Soviet Union, the 1950s, when actually Khrushchev was facing a series of revolts across the former Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Obviously, 1953, Germany, the workers in Berlin, and then 1956, the Soviets crushed the Hungarian anti-communist uprising. And so in the 1950s, it was of critical importance for the Soviet leadership to find an ideological banner around which they could unite their own people, but also to portray not only to the West but to the world that the Soviet Union is actually a liberator and not a conqueror. Because for the decade after 44, 45 until 56, the Soviet Union was the brutal conqueror of Eastern Europe. Suddenly, Khrushchev discovered, or the course of events, revealed to him that there is this vast third world. There's this vast global south, as we call it now. There's the Arab world. There's also, of course, Iran, Africa, Latin America. This global south was prone for exploitation by Soviet propaganda, Soviet military advisors, Soviet economic penetration. So ultimately, the roots of this mythology that the Soviet Union is a liberating force, in my opinion, comes from those Khrushchev years, and of course the support for Nasser in Egypt, and then the countless dictators across the Arab world, countless regimes, Africa and everywhere else, suddenly created this huge opening, this huge opportunity to show that, hey, the Soviet Union is actually, you call us imperialists. No, you are the imperialists and we are the liberators of the global South. And, quite naturally, Putin and his regime, just like they picked up on this, together with the main tenets of Soviet propaganda and ideology, the church and everything that we discussed earlier. So quite naturally, now they've been trying to portray the Soviet Union. I mean, look at Lavrov going to the African countries and how he was met there. So even their, let's say, conviction that even if the West has imposed sanctions, if they deal with countries like India, of course, China being perceived as a strategic partner, if not ally in certain ways, this will also create a way out of this Western imposed encirclement, whether it's a physical encirclement in military terms or legal and diplomatic and economic. So this goes back a long time, and unfortunately, many in the West have bought it, and many in the West have also bought it's pure lie that effectively NATO is some sort of an imperialist power. Nobody forces nations into NATO. On the contrary, nations are, if I may, banging on the door of NATO. I mean, it's for years, and trying to get their political systems, their military reformed so they can join the alliance. And therefore, this is completely different from Soviet times, where the Soviet Union was in total control of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the US is maybe the most important ally within NATO, but it doesn't have the 100% say there. You have to deal and negotiate with now 30 allies, and therefore it's a completely fake moral equivalence. It has no justification, has no rooting in any facts. But unfortunately, it's easy to manipulate people because not everybody knows these details of Soviet history, and of course. This anti-American propaganda has been going on for decades, even from Soviet times, of course. So it's easy for someone in the West to say, well, yeah, America is an aggressor, and it wants to steal, let's say, the riches of Afghanistan or Iraq or other countries. And then comes Russia that says, well, yeah, they look at what they're doing here and there. So this whataboutism has, of course, a mixture of certain facts. As you said, the troubled imperialist past of the West, but it's the past. What Russia is doing now maybe was done in the 18th century and the 19th century, the divisions of the world and of Europe of spheres of influence, imperial colonization, but it's no more. And so, someone has to, we have to have this moral strength, and of course, our historians, our experts, our journalists have to point out clearly where the facts lie and where the lies begin.
I think that's a really good point you make there, and this is one I sort of struggle to convince some people around, because they'll say, "Well, look at the US in the all the way through the 60s through to the 80s, meddling in countries, making alliances not necessarily with societies based on the rule of law." And some fairly, nasty dictatorships that were partners of, say, US within its foreign policy. But I think the point that I try to get across is that the US and all the members of NATO are fundamentally societies based on a domestic rule of law, and they have due process, which is totally absent in Russia. So I think the point you made there is that there's a fundamental difference between the relationships within the Western alliance and the partnerships that Russia brokers. So our partnerships are based on some kind of due process they're enshrined in rule of law. Partners sign up to certain commitments and changes in their internal societies in order to become part of that alliance, and you know, those treaties that are binding. Whereas Russians' foreign policy is based on unwritten constitutions, let's say, within those partnerships. It's based on strength and you know, shifting sands, not on any sort of codified system of rules. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And as I said, everything they've been doing since the 18th and the 19th century, they've continued doing it quite successfully these days. And definitely this power politics, this you know, imperial twisting of the arm of the weaker, let's say, neighbors, continues to this day. We shouldn't forget that you know, it's not only the rule of law, of course, within our Western societies, but even within the alliances. You know, as I mentioned, the U.S. has to negotiate and convince 29 other members of NATO. So there are complex mechanisms within each country and within each organization that we form. In the Russian world, if you will, in the Russian diplomatic realm, it's all about you know, Putin dealing with the dictator or with the leader of some country. Putin meeting with Assad, or you know, Lavrov meeting with the leadership of a dictatorship across the global south, and then they, you know, they discuss everything among themselves. And so it's a very personalistic, it's you know, it's really a primitive form of politics. This used to exist back in the Middle Ages and the, you know, quite, you know, before the modern era. That was really the nature of the business back then, and it's much easier for them. And Putin seems to perceive, I mean, I think even before the war, there were you know, many instances which demonstrated that he really believes that if you just call some leader in the West, let's say Merkel or if you talk to Macron or, you know, their predecessors, you can just straighten things out and then reach some sort of a deal, and then things will go smoothly. He had showed complete disregard for the process, and the due process, the democratic mechanisms within our societies, the complexity, because he himself hollowed out the Russian society and the Russian institutional system and made it, you know, created this power vertical. And so in his mind, you know, that's the way to do it. That's the way to solve issues. And of course, it doesn't work this way in the West. And ergo, we have this major, you know, even misperceptions in the West that you can deal with Putin the way you deal with a reasonable Western politician. Or at least that was the prevalent view, maybe in some quarters until up until the war.
And that's quite an important mutual misunderstanding, isn't it? Putin's acting a little like some kind of tribal warlord, thinking he can broker a partnership. And, you know, Scholz, Macron are thinking that they're dealing with somebody that has a whole system behind him, a system of advisors, and sort of a whole set of codified sort of bureaucracy that lines up behind that. But really, that doesn't exist. That's a kind of sham. And I don't know what you think, but I suspect Putin doesn't believe there is such a thing as opposition, doesn't believe there is such a thing as democracy. He's never, you know, despite living in East Germany, I don't think he's ever lived in a fully democratized society. He's never experienced it firsthand. He thinks that everything is a sham, a political technology. I mean, do you think he's that cynical?
I think cynicism is one of his main features. Cynicism about the nature of politics, not only within the Russian society, but also within the Western world. And you're absolutely right. He hasn't been able to internalize the complexities of the Western democratic system, but he doesn't need it. A normal democratic society would never elect in their right mind. I mean, the people, you know, a strong middle class with strong institutions would never elect really a former, you know, colonel from the security services of a dictatorial totalitarian regime. And, you know, why would he and his circle of confidants need any sort of democracy. And this is a much more convenient system that they've got there, that they built, that they were able to rebuild out of the collapsed remnants of the Soviet Union, and of course the Yeltsin's Russia that was teetering on the brink of collapse economically and otherwise. So cynicism, of course, cynicism about human nature. I mean, as a KGB operative, he's been trained to manipulate, people's weaknesses. I mean, you remember the case where he brought his dog to the meeting with Merkel, and she, knowing, being full aware that she's terrified of dogs, as far as I know. And so also the nature of Russian opposition and parties. I mean, the KGB created so many fake opposition leaders, and think of Zhirinovsky, and who was also, and so many others. So, there were legitimate, of course, political leaders and political parties in Russia, but it was all overwhelmed by this creation, really, of controlled opposition parties and leaders, and under the even in the late 80s during the perestroika period and the early Yeltsin years, and it was all or to a great extent manipulated by the security services. So in his view, they're all creatures of they're all the offspring of his own kind of a breeding ground, if you will, right? No need for him to give them any credence. I mean, he's comfortable with the system that he's designed, and unfortunately, the West thought for many years that they can deal with him as a normal Western politician, which he's not.
And this isn't new either, is it? I mean, that same technique was used by the Tsarist Empire, lining up with one side against another. And then when they were prevalent, they'd line up with somebody else to take those down. They also, it's rumored, created opposition figures, seeded the genuine opposition flooded them with agents, to the point where, it's absurd you might have more agents in a revolutionary party than actual oppositionists. And this becomes quite unstable, doesn't it? And I mean, my question really is, when did this whole police state really get established? Which Putin is not new. He's just yet another incarnation of a system which, I know, is it the 1870s? Do you have to go back that far to see the seeds of the current system?
Well, in the modern era, of course, but even if you go back in time to Ivan the Terrible, Oprichnina, this system that he designed, really of total control over the population and of its economic resources, and of course of his personal guard and secret police, effectively, that also carried his orders. The destruction of all of everything that was pro-Western, that had any elements of democratic developments. I mean, Novgorod, was burned to the ground, razed to the ground, and burned in the most brutal ways under Ivan the Terrible, who was, of course, the icon, the idol of Stalin himself. And so, yes, at every century of Russian or Soviet history, let's say of Russian imperial history, has had such instances, such systems, designed, redesigned, and then you'd have those brief hiatuses, those brief periods of liberalization, sometimes fake, sometimes legitimate, but always weak, or weakened ultimately and collapsing in chaos. And the troubles of whether it's the troubles of the early 1600s, or whether it's the post February Revolution of 1905, or whether it's the post Perestroika Yeltsin, it's all the same pattern. You have the strong hand with its all-powerful, all-seeing secret police or mechanisms of controlling the society. Then you have a collapse. Then you have a conflicts with the West, and then some sort of a liberalization, and then of course there's this yearning for this strong hand again, and so it becomes this endless cycle of ups and downs, from liberal up to absolutist and then totalitarian, and so it's been going on for not for decades but for several centuries.
And to an extent, that whole cycle is not in the benefit of its people, is it? I mean, that whole cycle of instability, repression, is to maintain an empire which actually is relatively fragile, isn't it? Composed of many, many nationalities, without a strong civic idea, without institutions with deep roots. And when we saw in the Russian Revolution of 1917, how quickly the existing institutions were swept away almost overnight. And you could say the same now, couldn't you? That despite strong, I would say, sort of cultural identity in Russia and a strong literature, it doesn't really have any deep institutions of any sort, political or social.
Absolutely, because as we said earlier, Putin's regime hollowed out any real institutions and took away all the real self-governance, by appointing governors. That was back, over a decade ago. He started rebuilding the system from really day one into office. I mean, going back to the launching of the or re-inflaming of the Chechen wars. All the doctrines out of all the doctrines that were introducing during his rule. The information one was number one in 2000. So obviously shows the supremacy of the propaganda in this new system, the new old system rather. And so as a result, you have this hollowed out society. It looks rigid on the surface, just like the Soviet Union did, but it's fraught with so many, quite unstable, fraught with many contradictions, as they say, and many tensions, ethnic. That's what, of course, you pointed out. Multiple autonomous republics in various regions. There are so many, dozens, if not hundreds, of ethnic groups that are not necessarily happy with Moscow's rule and Moscow's extraction of rent from their territories. Whether it's oil, gas, diamonds, aluminum, you name it, precious metals, and then them getting almost nothing in return. And so, the only thing, just like in Tsarist times or in Soviet times, that keeps it together is first this, of course, this repressive apparatus, and now this war is trying to play the role of this great, fatherland war of the mythical, Second World War, the Stalinist period, and that's why we see those repetitive invocations of Nazism, fascism. It's just borrowing from Stalin's playbook and reaching back into this Soviet history, trying to create a cohesive idea around which this very atomized society would coalesce. And I think he will fail in the long run. But from what we see from the outside, there are disturbing indications that many people in Russia are actually buying this poisonous ideology to a certain extent. Of course, with the effects of sanctions down the road, hopefully the humiliating defeat that the Russian forces will suffer at the hands of the Ukrainians, hopefully as early as this fall, reclaiming some territories, and all this combined pressure of the Western and Ukrainian efforts, hopefully will open the eyes of someone, of a critical mass of people within Russia. I'm not holding my breath. I have to be honest. I'm not quite optimistic. But I remember the good old days when everybody thought the Soviet Union was the most stable system on the planet, and then one night, one day it just disappeared, and almost nobody was able to predict that.
And I think this sets us up really nicely for the next video, where we're going to continue this conversation. This idea of terror, coercion, war, that leads us very nicely into the topic that we're going to talk about next. And Christine has something to say about that as well.